We're almost there.
At the round table with Mamley.
We almost good after.
I'm your host, Larry Ellison. In studio, my co-host, Dr. Bradley, is with us this morning.
I'm here. I'm here.
He's all warmed up now.
Well, yeah. You know what I mean?
He's all warmed up.
I can take my hat off.
Take my hat off to you. Take my hat off to you, sir. We've been having a very fascinating, interesting conversation with Dr. Tom Nolan, former lieutenant with the Boston Police Department, author of Perilous Policing, and a professor, a dean at Dr. Nolan. You still there?
I'm still here.
And what college are you at now, sir?
Emmanuel College.
Emmanuel. That's what we were trying to figure out here in the studio. And your role over there, so I want to make sure I give you the proper credits.
I am a visiting associate professor of sociology.
All right.
I noticed he emphasized visiting. It's nothing permanent.
Right. It's been a long visit, though. Usually visiting is only for a year, but I've been there for 3 years.
Yeah, no, that's where I'm going. Been there for a while.
He lost his GPS, so he's stuck in there. But he's been discussing this morning, folks, and very articulate with it and very detailed, the recent appellate court decision as it relates to the Boston Police Gang database, how it's compiled and who it's compiled against, and what's staggering is that, folks, if you weren't listening in the last hour, that 97% of the people in the Boston Police database are people of color. Those numbers just don't reflect the population. It's always when it's something in the negative, Dr. Nolan, that we seem to be overrepresented in incarceration, overrepresented in the police database, but never in our numbers are nowhere near 97% of representation in the Boston Police Department as far as police officers, and particularly when you start to look at the upward mobility in the Boston Police Department. This is just staggering. And as you said, I know the ACLU got involved, and the Lawyers for Civil Rights has been very, Yvonne Espinoza there has been, dogged with the Boston Police Department about accountability. And that's what I think has been lacking for quite some time, is accountability, and they've been left to their own demise. And every time they get caught, Dr. Nolan, they said, we're going to do better. And I remember when they got caught, and it was interesting when you talked about how they were supposed to start reporting this out, and then they stopped keeping it by race. And we all know that was just a way of, if you don't keep it by race, then we can't say that
we're being racist,
right? We don't keep the race of the person, but yet the stops are,
Well, you send that
in the same neighborhood.
You send that message of we're being transparent, we're being fair, we don't consider racial people.
Yeah,
and that's not really the truth.
No, it's nowhere near the truth. So, Dr. Nolan, let's dive a little bit deeper into the what you took away from the appellate court, the federal appeals court, as it relates to the behavior and what this does going forward for the Boston Police Department and their use of the brick. Because as you said, you think it should be scrapped entirely, and it sounds like the courts have given very little credence to its credibility going forward with this decision that I've read.
Well, I think the decision all but said that the database is useless and shouldn't be relied upon. So I don't see that, and this is appellate review. This is a very high-level review in the federal court system. And as I mentioned earlier, this is one step down from the U.S. Supreme Court. And they're saying that this database, there's no rationale for this point system, but nonetheless it persists. And it should be said that they rewrote the rule 335. They kept this point system in, and as the First Circuit observed, there's no rationale for these points. And, where do you get the point system? Where does it come from? And what is is there any empirical basis? Is there any research that's been conducted, that's been validated, that supports the use of this type of a system? And the court pointed out there's no explanation as to how someone gets 2 points for this and 8 points for that. And there isn't. And so in that, this is something that is a manifestation of systemic and institutional racism. And that needs to be said. When you've got 97% of the people, and this is something that was the director of the BRIC, who I believe is a civilian.
Yes.
I don't know this person, but he was called to testify before the city council last March. and he said that he testified that there were almost 4,000 people in the database, and that there were over 100 gangs in Boston. And I know there have been media reports published, but we have 161 gangs in Boston. I mean, I live in the city. I've lived in the city most of my life. Where are these 161 gangs?
But also,
where are these?
Who gets to classify someone
that's where I'm going.
as a gang?
As a gang. You know,
Well, if you look at their definition in Rule 335, Tom Nolan, Willie Bradley, and Larry Ellison could be classified as a gang. All right, so we're the Mamleo Roundtable, so we have a territory. All right, and if any one of us has ever committed a crime, and we have some kind of association with each other, that's Mamleo, we could be classified under Rule 335 as a gang. A gang, in essence, is whatever the Boston Police Department says it is.
Yes.
And a gang member is whoever the Boston Police Department says is a gang member.
Well, that's the point I'm trying to make here, is that folks don't understand. Like, folks are in there and don't even know they're in there. And with this recent decision, do you feel, and it's not a legal opinion, that there's some legal responsibility that the Boston Police Department could put themselves in peril with continuing to gather information this way, but also if someone is trying to find out whether or not they're in this database, because they don't notify you that you're in there, how does one go about finding out if they're in the Boston Police or any database such as this, and getting themselves out of there? But also continuation of the Boston Police Department to use this information gathering system. Do they face any legal consequences?
To your first point, it was stated during this testimony before the city council that if someone wants to dispute their being included in the gang database, they should send a letter to the office of the legal advisor at the Boston Police Department. The legal advisor will review it, okay? What 17-year-old kid, seriously, do you think is going to have the presence of mind to say, I wonder if I'm in the gang database? Let me send them a letter and ask them if I'm in it, and then if I am, let me contest it. It's just not a realistic prospect for anyone. So the mechanism, I think there should be a mechanism that if you want to include someone in a database, you need to notify them of that. That's not in the federal regulation that governs databases. It's a flaw in the system that the same procedure that exists in the Boston Police Department is the one that exists at the federal level. But they have rewritten this rule, and they have completely removed any reference to the federal regulation. They had it in the earlier version, called 28 CFR Part 23, which no one wants to know or even remember. But they had that included in the 2017 version of the gang assessment database rule 335. They plucked it out in the 2021 version, and so there's no reference to or acknowledgement in this rule that they're bound by any kind of federal regulation. So they're basically saying we're ignoring the federal regulation governing what they call interjurisdictional intelligence systems. And they do, and to Larry's question, and it's an excellent question, what are the consequences that they face? And so they were sternly rebuked by the First Circuit Court of Appeals, and I would take that very seriously. If I was a police administrator or a policymaker, I'd say, hey, the First Circuit just slapped us down pretty harshly, and we really need to revisit this. I mean, the sanction that potentially exists is the withholding of federal funds. So the reason the Boston Police Department is required to comport with this federal regulation is because they receive federal grant funds. And so in theory, those funds could be jeopardized.
Right.
Realistically, I don't think anything's going to happen.
Right, because
I think
the problem, Dr. Nolan, is that normally who ends up paying and literally paying are the taxpayers, right? Is that, people say the city of Boston. It's not the city of Boston, it's the taxpayers. So this is why people, if they're not held accountable personally, right, in all these lawsuits, it's the taxpayers that end up writing the check on behalf of the city. That's why the behavior is not changed, because no one is held personally responsible. Because if I'm the head of the brick and I'm the deputy or the director up there, and I continue with this after this rebuke, then I should be held personally accountable, right? You would think.
Well, to Dr. Bradley's point earlier about policing being a profession, and if that's what we are, then we should be held professionally and personally responsible. If you're a professional, like an attorney or a physician, and I don't not suggesting that law enforcement officers are in that league, but they carry private malpractice insurance, and they're held personally responsible. If you violate some canon of ethics as an attorney in your representation of me and my situation, I can sue you. And you have private insurance that you pay for out of pocket. Why should it be any different for police? That the taxpayers always assume financial responsibility if, in the unlikely event there is a lawsuit, individual police officers are never held to any accountability. They should be, and this has been put out there as something to consider, be required to carry individual insurance. So if you're someone who can be held personally responsible and accountable for your behavior on the job, and the first step is the post-decertification. We'll wait and see if they decertify any police officers. I'm not going to hold my breath on that. But qualified immunity, the next step for the legislature would be to revisit that issue. And if it's revisited, police officers should be required to carry personal liability insurance. And if you're someone who's out there doing the wrong thing and you're consistently getting called out for it, your insurance is going to skyrocket.
Right, but to that point, Dr. Nolan, the BRIC, the Boston Regional Intelligence Center, is mainly staffed by civilians, right? So there's that kind of loophole there. Even though the information is gathered primarily by law enforcement out on the front line, or information that comes in, they're the ones who process it, and they're the ones who are tasked with this point system. How do you hold them accountable? Because they're not held accountable in the same way now with the changes in the post and the OPAT at the city level, where there's some accountability now attached to law enforcement, police officers, sworn personnel. But there are civilians who have just as much input in law enforcement as sworn personnel, but they're not captured in the accountability piece.
Well, how can we hold them accountable if we don't know what they're doing?
Yes.
And so I wrote a chapter in a law school book called the Cambridge Handbook of Surveillance Law. It's a big, huge book, and I wrote a chapter on fusion centers. And fusion centers are essentially domestic spy operations. And so the curtain was pulled back a little bit by the immigration bar, the attorneys representing detainees in immigration proceedings, and we saw a glimpse through the window at the gang database. But by no means is that all that's going on in fusion centers generally, and the BRIC in particular, because it's shielded from any kind of public inspection or oversight. So we don't know what the hell they're doing in the BRIC. They do have, I'll give you an example, the use of, I don't know if folks here are familiar with Stingray devices. Those are cell phone site simulators. Okay, so they can basically monitor cell phone activity that is going on in the Boston Police Department and in the BRIC. And there was public reporting a couple of years back about a non-disclosure agreement. This goes back to the tenure of Commissioner Davis that he signed with a bunch of people. I'm happy to share this. I don't know how you would look at it publicly, but this is in the public domain, and it's a non-disclosure agreement between the Boston Police Department and the FBI that pertains to the use of these cell phone site simulator devices that monitor people's cell phones without their knowledge, approval, awareness, without any kind of search warrant that's required under the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution. And the NDA that they signed, a non-disclosure agreement, says that if it gets discovered that they're using these devices, that they will move to have any criminal cases dismissed. So basically, they signed an agreement that says they're going to hide the use of these devices from defense attorneys. And that's just so we begin to see the window gets pulled back, the curtain slightly.
That's scary, big brother.
That is scary
because there's no consequences for violating people's rights. That's really scary, in the sense that these things would normally you'd need a search warrant, and even though you're not because if you don't get caught, then you are using that information for search warrants for probable cause. But if you get caught with it, then you just dump it. You're allowed to just dump it. Wow.
Yeah,
Well,
you signed an agreement saying that you'd dump it.
Well,
And,
how you
and so the device.
how you circulating? How you circumventing the wiretap though? I don't. Does
Because
that
you're
factor
saying
in?
that the use of the devices, they vary in the distance that they can measure stuff. So,
Okay.
in fact, the Stingray devices, I think, are probably, by technological standards, are probably, I won't say obsolete, but they're probably dated. There are later versions of this, and they can, for example, surveil the entire area of, say, Kenmore Square. All right, so I'm not specifically targeting Dr. Bradley's phone. He's the guy I'm looking
okay, I
for.
got you.
I'm capturing metadata
I got you.
on
I got you.
everybody.
Okay,
Wink,
I
wink,
got you.
nod.
So-
But wink, wink, nod, nod. I know Dr. Bradley is in Kenmore Square, and I'm
Yeah,
looking for
yeah,
him.
Yeah,
but
exactly. But
Exactly.
this
I'm looking at
way,
everyone. Okay, I got you.
I'm being general. I'm
Yeah.
not targeting him. That's why I don't need the normal things I would need to go after his phone in particular. But if I can capture him in the group, then
Then he just,
it's
you know-
the plain view doctrine.
Yeah, he just caught in the net. I'm casting a wide fishing net here.
Casting a wide net,
Yeah.
and if his defense attorney, and if I get Dr. Bradley committing a crime, and his defense attorney asks, "How did you get this information on him walking through Kenmore Square?"
Yeah.
I am required through this non-disclosure agreement not to divulge the use of this device. And if the lawyer's good enough, and if the lawyer is tenacious enough and dogged enough in representing his client, he's going to find out. And then I'm required under this NDA to go to the prosecutor and request that the charges be dismissed rather than divulge the existence of this device.
617-282-0685, 617-282-0685. You're listening to At the Round Table with Ma'am Leo. On the line, our guest, Dr. Tom Nolan. He is the visiting professor at Emmanuel College, also the author of Perilous Policing, and just been on the line with us for the last hour, just enlightening us, on this recent court decision in the first court appellate court for the federal courts, really rebuking the behavior and the operations in the Boston Police Department as it relates to their gathering information in their BRIC, the Boston Regional Intelligence Center, and just hearing what he's saying here just recently about how the Boston Police Department has a non-disclosure where they can capture information, and you called it again. It would the terms used to capture this.
The nickname of it is a Stingray, and there's also a later version of it that's called a Dirt Box.
The Stingray, which gathers your information in a large group, and they have a non-disclosure agreement that allows them to do this. This is scary. This is scary because, there are folks who you could target, folks like myself, even if you just wanted to know, in my former title as president of Ma'am Leo, same as Dr. Bradley, that if you wanted to find out what we were talking about, where, because, your cell phone tells wherever you are, whether you want to or not, and that's why I like the work phone. I leave it at home if they want to find it. If I'm not working, that's where it is, and you can find it in the drawer. Because I don't trust, they're telling me that they're not monitoring it.
It's a GPS.
It's their property.
It's a GPS now.
It's their property, so they can do with it as they please. So to tell me that you're not, if I'm not working, it's in the drawer.
Yeah.
But to know that you can spy on people in this way, is this all as a result of part of the Patriot Act, Dr. Nolan, or is this just something that independently that they've come into these agreements with these
the authorities that were given to law enforcement at the local, state, county, and federal level were increased exponentially through the USA Patriot Act, particularly for federal law enforcement, and even in places like the BRIC, that is a fusion center. You do have often federal presence in the fusion center. So your point earlier, Larry, that we have civilian analysts there. Yes, we do. We have sworn Boston police personnel, and we will, from time to time, have representation from other agencies, including federal agencies like the Department of Homeland Security. We've talked about ICE. That was how this whole issue with the immigration detention hearings and the quote-unquote gang packets came to public knowledge, was through their collaboration with immigration officials and deportation proceedings. So, the Patriot Act certainly got the ball rolling. But another thing worth mentioning, too, is the technology. As we all know, technology advances in leaps and bounds. And so in the drawdown of the wars that we fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, this huge apparatus existed that provided technology to the military, now had a largely diminished market for those products, those technologies that they were selling to the military. So they then turned and said, well, let's sell it to law enforcement. These dirt boxes and Stingray devices, they were initially developed for use by federal agencies like, and I'm sure we're all probably aware that the CIA and the NSA and those kinds of agencies have technological capabilities. The scary part for people who live in cities and who have local law enforcement agencies engaging in the same activities is troubling.
Well, it's interesting, Dr. Nolan. Dr. Bradley and I was just speaking about that on the break, and we're saying, all this technology from the military and stuff has been donated to local cities and towns, and then we were talking about the armored vehicles and stuff, the war surplus that they had, they've given it. And with police agencies, when they get new toys,
you got to use them.
They have to use them. So my question is that who is charged with the oversight and protecting the rights of and I know the answer is probably clear and apparent based on the conversation we're having. No one, but there's no one charged with making sure that this isn't abused. I mean, that the only consequence if you get caught is to just disregard the information that you have and say we're not going to use it, but you are using it because it's allowing you to gather intelligence about people.
I mean, thankfully we have organizations like the ACLU. And they should not be standing alone in holding law enforcement agencies' feet to the fire. I mean, they have a technology and liberty project at the ACLU in Massachusetts that's directed by Cade Crockford, and she's someone you might want to have on your. She's more knowledgeable about the technology stuff than I am, and that wouldn't be a bad idea to have Cade on your program at some point, but. It shouldn't be that outside agencies like ACLU are the entities that are holding the police to an accountability. There should be some kind of meaningful oversight, and the jury is still out as to how effective the civilian oversight mechanism in Boston that's just been set up. I haven't heard anything since they hired someone to direct it.
No, there's not much been going on. That's the problem. We were saying earlier, as we alluded to, is that they set up these things. It's like it's all a stall tactic, in my opinion, right? To say we're doing something, and then when they get a program, a finished product, it collects dust, and they know that these agencies, the ACLU, the Lawyers for Civil Rights, and other organizations like that, they don't have the taxpayer money to fight. And like I said, it takes forever to get this information because they'll stall. It's similar to what they're going through from the January 6th insurrection in the committee. They're trying to get the facts, just the truth about what's going on with in our country. It's the same thing here with your Samson trying to fight Goliath, trying to get anything from the police department. I know in NAMLIA we have submitted requests on the under the FOIA Act, and it's like pulling teeth on public information. This is public documents.
Information, and they're going to say you have to pay $5,000 for it and all of this stuff. I think if we go in the direction that other cities that have had troubled police departments, like Chicago
Brookline
and Oakland, and so Chicago, for example, has what's called the Civilian Office of Police Accountability, COPA, and they conduct all internal investigations that involve officer use of force. If you have a complaint against a Chicago police officer, you go to COPA. And COPA are civilian investigators. They have about 150 personnel, and they actually respond out to officer-involved shooting incidents. And
so these are not police officers.
These are not police officers.
These are not police officers. These are civilian investigators. They are not armed. And if there is a deadly force incident in Chicago involving a Chicago police officer, they respond out 24/7 to wherever, and they take over the investigation of that deadly force incident from the initial point of where it happened, and they follow through to the end of the investigation. And if you have a complaint of excessive force against a Chicago police officer, you go to this agency.
they former
there
police
is an
officers?
internal affairs apparatus in Chicago PD,
Okay.
but it's only for internal complaints.
Okay.
So if Deputy Bradley has a complaint about my being insubordinate to him, he goes to internal affairs. But for people who are stopped on the street and treated
Two different layers.
disrespectfully or treated roughly, they go to COPA. And Oakland has a similar model. This is a model that ratchets up the authority of these outside investigative agencies, these civilian oversight agencies, that they have subpoena power. They have the authority to make recommendations to the chief executive officer. So they've got some teeth. And we don't have, there is subpoena power, I believe, with this latest iteration of the civilian oversight
I like that.
apparatus that we have in Boston, but there are a few hurdles that have to be met in order to have a subpoena issued. And certainly, just like you described, Larry, with the FOIA from Mamleo, I mean, Boston, the PD can stall that.
Absolutely.
We got a subpoena for internal documents.
Right.
We may or may not turn it over.
Right.
We may turn it over next year.
Right, and by that
Right,
time,
like
hopefully the the players have changed, and no one's interested in it. That is the
Exactly.
hope and expectation.
Yep.
But also, when you talk about the civilian, Boston has set up, and it hasn't been challenged yet because that was a mandate by the mayor, and I'm not sure if that has as much teeth in
Doesn't
it
sound like
as the one that the legislators, because that's in the law, right? Because Boston is only germane to Boston police officers.
Yep.
The post is statewide, and the power comes from the state, so it's broader. And I'm not diminishing it. I'm just saying it as I think on a legal challenge. I'm not sure if the city council or the mayor, can issue those powers in that way. And there's been some question of whether or not, I guess, is the appropriate way to phrase it.
Hopeful, but I will say that California has had a post system for many years, and they have issues out there with police officers moving from department to department, and police officers. I do a lot of media commentary on the West Coast, probably more than here, and they recently passed a sunshine law that allowed public access to criminal charges that were levied against police officers in California. And they found the numbers were astonishing. They were in the tens of thousands of criminal complaints that had been granted against police officers in California, yet they remained on the job. And they have a strong post system. They have a decertification system. So I hope, and I'm partially optimistic, that we might have a better result with post here in Massachusetts, but I have no reason to believe that it's going to be any different than what exists in other states.
So Dr. Nolan and Dr. Bradley as well, I am the new police commissioner, and that's no means of advocating. And there hasn't been a reorganization in the Boston Police Department since I can't remember a real reorganization from top to bottom. I call you two gentlemen in, and I say, I want you to map out what you think the Boston Police Department in this day, in this age, from top down, how this should be structured. What advice do you give me? Dr. Nolan, I'll start with you, and then we'll go to Dr. Brad.
A restructuring of the department? That's a tall order. I think what might be a question that, if I were in your shoes, Larry, I'm the new commissioner, I would be, all right, the nuts and bolts of reorganizing our department, that's something that we can consider. But the problems that have arisen historically in this department really are owing more to the culture that we have here.
Okay, so let me rephrase it in some way. What would be my priorities is what you think I need to tackle first to get us at least heading in the right direction?
I think that, and this is a challenge, significant and formidable challenge. It's how do I change the culture of this department to one that emphasizes collaboration with the community, that emphasizes accountability, that emphasizes responsibility. And I know we all got, how many years have we got on the job between the three of us?
Over 100, almost
over 100
almost 150.
Yeah, and so it hasn't changed since
No.
I came on in 1978. I have no
No.
reason to believe that the culture's any different now. But moving, I think, what if you're asking the question, what can I do? Change the ways that we identify people who are a valuable part of our organization. All right, so let's start with promotions. We've been talking about this since I was at Mamrio in 2008, trying to help that along.
All right, yeah, much appreciated.
How do we scrap this civil service system? That's a thing that needs to go. That's a relic. That's a dinosaur. And so I could see this new commissioner. Why don't we bring in leadership from outside the department, like many departments do? Why should you have to be a police officer in the Boston Police Department to be a supervisor or a manager? Why wouldn't I hire people from outside the department? Why do I need a pencil and paper test to identify people who are going to be commanders of my 11 districts, making $250,000 a year? We take a pencil and paper test and maybe some kind of a in-basket thing. Is there a better way to identify people who are leaders? Is there a better way to identify people who should be given the privilege of being a detective? I think that certainly is, and that would change the tone of how things are done in the department. If my lieutenant was not someone who had been on the job for 20 years, who has a history of whatever with the department, if this was someone who came in from Oregon or Maine, who's my lieutenant, and this is the model that many departments have, that they hire people from the outside to manage and lead their organization. Not just the commissioner, but people why wouldn't we bring in people from the outside? They have no allegiances, they have no history with the department. That may be something to consider. And yes, reorganization along the lines of, I mean, we have so much, and you guys know this from being on the job, so much baggage and excess. I mean, I ride by the police headquarters building most days of the week, and I'd be hard-pressed to tell the difference between a community engagement unit and a community service unit. What's the difference?
There isn't, except the name, as you said, right? And that's what I'm saying. It's like you when you alluded to, you worked in a gang unit. It's been called youth violence. I mean, so you change the name, but you still operate in the same manner. It's not a change. It's just like in Boston here, they changed the names of these schools and they haven't gotten any better. The name change somehow makes people think that there's a new nuance,
a new way of doing business,
right,
but it has
right.
the same way.
So, Dr. Bradley, what would be your recommendation?
Well, I would look at it from multiple perspectives, because I do agree with a lot of things that Tom is saying. But I will look at, number one, community relations. Exactly what do I do as a leader, as an administrator, to improve the relationship or the reputation of the Boston Police Department, in particular the underprivileged community. I will also look at fully implementing with teeth a community review apparatus that will hold accountable officers who are operating outside of the scope of their training. And then internally, I will want to have the authority to select a command structure that is appropriate for the positions that they are actually operating in. And I talked about the Peter Principle earlier, but I will want to have someone who understands exactly how to run the area that they're in charge of. And I also restructured the organization, because I'm a very big proponent of community policing. I feel that we're missing an opportunity here to improve relationship, but also involve the community in the process without relinquishing any authority of any commander who's involved in actually working with the community. So I think that we need to embrace the idea around civilian review boards a lot. I love the idea that Tom just put out about Chicago, because I think there's two separate issues: the citizen complaints about police officers abusing their authority, and citizen and commanders' complaints about officers being disobedient and not listening to their orders are two separate animals. You know, so I would look at it in a way like that. I would look at how do I structure this in such a way that my last piece, I can be a little bit loquacious when we're talking about this because I'm so deep into it. My last piece would be, you know, how do I deal with nepotism in the police department? Because that becomes a situation where you're circumventing authority easily, and that happened to me as a commander.
Right.
You know,
and I
how
think
do I deal with
that's well. There's two things I want to highlight. You know, because that came up the other night. I don't know if you were on that call. They had a Zoom call, Dr. Nolan, for the search committee and listening to the public, and people really came down hard on former Commissioner Ed Davis. And the attorney for Mamleo, he highlighted, when Commissioner Davis, I remember at the City Hall hearing, we were talking about the issues internally with the officers of color in the police department. And he said, nepotism and cronyism was alive and well in the Boston Police Department. And no, I didn't disagree with him, but where he fell short was he didn't lay out what he was doing to deal with it. And no one has. So he opened the door, but he didn't come up with a resolution. He didn't define how he was dealing with that problem, because that is a huge problem. The other one, if I'm the commissioner, gentlemen, help me out, is how do I tackle, because we said Boston is a very strong union police department. How do I deal with those factions of the police department that are going to fight me tooth? Like you said, you were filing a grievance every day. That's not going to change. How do we change that?
Well, one of the things that I had, and I wanted to go back to my command staff experience when I was a command staff on the Paul Evans. The union, I had to constantly remind them that I run the operation, not you. You know what I mean? So they were in a position where, and it was habit. They didn't come in and say, "Deputy, this is what we want you to do." I'm like, excuse me? I'm looking at my left shoulder, looking at my right shoulder, and I have 3 stars here. And you're telling me how you're going to run the show? So I think, Tom was absolutely on target, is that let's redefine what working conditions are about. What constitutes that? The fact that I'm assigning this officer to a supervisory staff situation, and he wants to be in an office, and I'm changing his working condition because I changed his assignment. Are you kidding me? Come on.
Well, right assignment is something they never gave away. So you've been in the union, you in an official role as vice president of the Superior Officers Federation. How do we change that? Because I think that's the biggest elephant in the room when it comes to change.
That's the biggest elephant in the room that tends to hide itself very well in any discussion, because we very seldom tackle that issue, in any discussion.
Very seldom. We've never tackled it.
But as a commander, it's so frustrating when the union member or when the union leadership has the right to tell you, who knows nothing about what you're doing, this is how it's going to happen. I'm like, well, I'm not breaching the contract. The union's about the contract. I'm not breaching the labor contract I have here. So how is it your concern?
What I was somewhat heartened to hear that Mayor Wu intends, and one of her many priorities, is to renegotiate these public safety union contracts. And one provision, and this is in the law, and this would have to be done at the state legislature. It may be time to reconsider the issue of binding arbitration. So the wins and the victories that the unions have obtained over the years, over the decades, have been because they have this authority to go if they bargain to impasse. And so I believe they're bargaining for contracts now. And so there's a bargaining committee. They meet with the city and the city's representatives every so often, and they have a wish list. The city has a wish list. The unions have a wish list. And ultimately, they will, and this has been the history, is they bargain to impasse, so they don't come to an agreement. Marty Walsh had some degree of success because he comes from a labor union background. But bargaining to impasse gives the unions the authority to then seek out binding arbitration, and they go before arbitrators. And I'm familiar, I won't bore you with the selection process, but they can basically handpick the arbitrator who's going to hear the case and render a decision that's most often favorable to labor, to the union. And so if we can change that, and so if the last and final offer is one that has to be accepted by the unions, then we don't have this ability to basically do an end run around the whole negotiation process and go before someone who we've handpicked to give us the decision that we want with the force and effect of law.
So you're stacking the deck. It's basically what's
And
Stacking
so
it.
these
You're
little
dealing from
incremental-
from the bottom.
Yeah, exactly. Wow.
And it's something, I remember back in the day, we used to have these little, if you look at the contract, I haven't looked at one in a while, but I got pretty good at reading them, and I remember we got like 0.5% pay raise for a hazardous duty differential, and then we got 0.5% for a 911 response specialist. And all of these little quirky kind of, incremental little increases, 0.5% at the time. I remember saying, "What's 0.5%?" We weren't making much money at the time. 0.5% was not much, but we built on that. So I haven't seen the most recent contract, but chances are all of these little perks that have been negotiated over the years are going to be difficult to take back. And until like Dr. Bradley's description of being on the command staff and being that 3-star general and being told basically by enlisted personnel that, no, we're not going to do it your way. Yeah, you are the boss, I guess. We're going to do it the union's way. And if we don't get our way, we're going to file a grievance against you. And, and most of the time, the grievances, the ones that aren't resolved, usually if they go through the process, are resolved in favor of the union. This whole, this whole vaccination mandate, for example, that is an issue that we've talked about whether or not it falls under working conditions, but it's a money grab. It's nothing other than that. It's something that we want to get some kind of a pay differential or a pay increase or some kind of stipend or some other consideration for getting a life-saving vaccination. I mean, think about that.
I'm going to pay you to save your life.
Yeah. I'm going to pay you to save your life. And I go with Dr. Bradley. I agree 100% that we really need to have more community input. We need to go out and listen to people like Jamal, the gentleman who was on the call earlier. Those voices, instead of being silenced and sidelined, they need to be heard and listened to.
Well,
and we need, hundreds of Jamals.
See, the problem with that, Dr. Nolan, is that if you listen to someone and then you may have to do something. So if we ignore them, then you don't have to do anything.
But that means that if your objective is really to do something, then you wouldn't have a problem.
When has that been?
I mean, I'm saying, you're right. You're right. But if you're really honest about making change and deep structural and deep-rooted changes and reform, then you wouldn't have a problem embracing the Jamals of the community. In fact, you will want them to be a part of the process.
Right. But that's sort of pushback, but I think some ways that, if the city were to structure this correctly, because a lot of people haven't taken it, that with the Supreme Court changes and having to belong to a union several years ago, a lot of people still think you have to belong to a union. In the police department, you don't have to belong.
No, you don't. But that idea, that notion that a union is necessary is so well entrenched in the minds of officers. That they don't even begin to think about not belonging to a union. It's the cultural thing to do.
Right.
Not, you know what I mean?
Right.
So,
it's an interesting thing to look at. It's almost a microcosm of what's going on in Boston. Is the little town that's dropped right in the middle of the city, Brookline. They've had 4 police chiefs in the last 2 years.
And looking for a new one now.
Looking for a new one now, and they've got it's a department of I think 130 officers, 63,000 population. But the people who run the town are the selectmen. They don't have it's a town, so they don't have a mayor, but they have a board of selectmen, and those folks are reimagining policing, and they have an entirely new vision for what they want in their police department. And they are at loggerheads, at war with the cops, because they say that we want our chief to come in. They want to scrap civil service. They want the chief to come in, the new chief, and select his or her entire command staff and have a leadership team that is selected by the chief. They've even talked about, at some point in the future, no longer having an armed police force in Brookline. And that's something, I think it's a fair question. And I know anybody I would say this to in law enforcement would think I've lost my marbles, but do we really need to have all of our police officers armed? Or should that be something that you earn? Because most of what the police, upwards of 90% of what the police respond to daily
Doesn't require-
are service calls.
Yeah.
So
It
someone
doesn't-
broke into my car and stole my sunglasses. Do I need an armed police officer coming up in a marked police cruiser to take a report for that?
Yeah, well, I know Brookline is, I think, that, and that's debatable, and I agree. The problem is that if
Well,
the
you
person is still on scene that
Yeah.
might be lurking.
Well, you have union issues with that.
Right.
You have that whole idea is that's the way we have always
Right,
done it.
right.
Yeah.
This is not Bobby. The Bobbies over in
In
London.
England, right.
You know what I mean? So you
Right.
have all those different types of approaches on
Mm-hmm.
and arguments as to why we should not think outside of
Right.
the box to that level.
Well, and just want to go back to Brookline for a moment, there, Dr. Nolan and Dr. Bradley, is that the only reason why Brookline and Boston you would think would have the same, but they have deeper pockets than a Brookline, even though Brookline has a more affluent community, but it's not as large. Like I said, it's 63,000 is their population. Is that they've had to spend out close to $30 million in lawsuits of late, right? And racial issues with the firefighter, the police officers. So
Yep.
they see it as a financial incentive, and also because they want to label themselves as a progressive city, they don't want that stigma attached to them. So now they're forced. But Boston doesn't see itself, in that transformative.
Well, which is one of the other things I think is important for the upcoming, the new commissioner. We have to understand in police leadership that the history of policing in America is not very clean, if you will.
No.
We have to also understand that policing is the law enforcement apparatus of a society that is technically really unjust.
Right.
And so you're going to have these issues. There's no question about that. But you have to have leadership who's willing and ready to go to the, go to the front, fight
Right.
for fair and equitable policing. But you have to have leadership at the upper
that's-
level of government
Right.
who's going to support the leadership in
But
policing.
that's true. But see, when Michelle Wu, the mayor of City of Boston, current mayor, signaled that, it's literally on her doorstep, right? That it's not just her that's impacted by her pushback and her saying change. So the fact that she signaled she wanted change, look what is happening.
Exactly.
With her.
But
The
what-
attack on her
the
by first responders and others.
union. I'm telling you,
Right.
the
This
biggest
is unprecedented.
The biggest problem that I see with police reform in the city of Boston is the union. And think about the amount of union representation at every layer.
Yeah.
Boston Petroleum Association.
I mean, they're a
The best-
multi-million-dollar.
There you go.
They own real estate. They own commercial
right.
real estate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that is a huge obstacle to overcome with financial resources to challenge you, through the court system.
Not just the court system, through the ballot box. Because
Exactly.
that's,
Exactly. So that is a huge fight for a commissioner that's coming
Yeah.
on board.
So, Dr. Nolan, I want to get your take on this. Is with this recent, like I said, the approach that first responders are taking as it relates to Mayor Michelle Wu and bringing this to her home and her children. I find it appalling. I think when people have children and family, they don't sign up for, even though they're married. That person's home and their family is off limits. It's off limits. What I find appalling, I don't care, police officers, no one should be going to the mayor's house. She works at City Hall. This is where they should be if you want to protest and picket. That's the public building.
But it also speaks to residency as a
I
Boston
tweeted
police
about
officer.
this, and my comments were that no one would have ever thought of protesting at the home of Mayor Kevin White, Mayor Tom Menino,
No.
Mayor Marty Walsh. I think they went to Marty Walsh's house for one day, one time.
right.
There were no bullhorns.
Right.
There were no references to Nazis or
Right.
Hitler. And the fact
Fascism.
that this is a young woman of color,
Right.
and our first and a daughter of immigrants, that should be lost on no one.
Thank you.
And that the first responders come together as a group and go after a woman mayor of color. It's racism,
Yeah.
is what, and I think we should
Call
we
it
would
what
be
it is.
remiss if we didn't call it out, and if we didn't also call out the history of discriminatory practices and racial oppression that has characterized law enforcement in the United States since its inception. And the Boston Police Department likes to take the title of being the first in the nation,
Yeah.
which is inaccurate. The first police departments in the United States with the slave patrol.
Yeah. Remember I said that?
And this
Yeah.
is the legacy of that. In the 21st century, in the year 2022,
Yeah.
we still have, when we've got a gang database with 97% of the people listed are people of color in a city that is in representation to the numbers in the population that is completely out of whack, and it is a manifestation of systemic racism. It can't be called anything other than that.
No, this stuff with her, the misogynism, the racism, the sexism,
Exactly.
is way, way over the top. And these are people, but I mean, to that point, gentlemen, these are folks who are armed professionals, supposedly, right? That how do you walk it back from now this person coming to my house? How do I think they might feel about me if they're making these comments and statements about someone just because of their...
Well, first of all, I will argue, I'll push back on that they're professionals. 'Cause professionals wouldn't do that. But they are armed. I mean, I'll give you that.
Okay.
And they're frightening our mayor and
Yeah.
you
And
know,
her
they're-
children.
Yeah.
and her children, and I believe I'm told she has an elderly parent living with her,
And also her neighbors.
and the neighbors
Yeah,
in
the
the
neighbors.
street,
Yeah.
and using bullhorns and screaming epithets. And there are limits to First Amendment protection,
Right.
time, place, and manner restrictions.
Right.
And I think, given the time, where they are engaging in the protest, and the manner in which they are doing so, really stretches the limits of First Amendment protections. And I would argue that it exceeds those protections.
Right.
So if there's a way to make your message heard,
Right.
and doing this is personal, and this would not be happening to an Irish man, a white Irish guy who was mayor.
Right. So do you
Or
get-
even,
Do you guys
know,
think that's a short falling of the leadership from someone addressing that issue in a very stern manner, that it won't be tolerated?
You know, I don't think anyone wants to take certainly the mayor could direct her police department to take some kind of action, but I think she's probably wisely reluctant to do so. But certainly we've got enough 3 and 4 and 5-star generals over at One Schroeder Plaza that someone could at some point say, you know what, enough. And the fact that first responders go out and engage in this kind of activity, to me, is tone deaf, because you don't have the support of the community.
Right.
People are not sympathetic to police unions objecting to getting vaccinated.
Right.
So your ability to read the room is severely diminished, first responder folks.
Yeah.
And going to the mayor's house and engaging in this is not a good look for you.
No.
I can tell you, as someone who lives in the city, this is definitely not the look that you want to have. And it's because you live in and exist in such an insular culture that you don't realize that people aren't supporting you.
No.
So-
especially when it comes to also when you're scaring children. You know, I mean,
Well, my argument.
Scaring children, you're frightening the mayor, physically frightening her.
yeah.
And I know she has a security detail, and I don't think there's any reason for her safety is not in jeopardy.
Yeah.
But be human beings about it.
But the other side of it is they're doing this for inoculations or vaccines. Then when it comes down to reform,
I think that's just a guise for folks having lost their candidate and they were looking for anything to go full throttle.
well, yes, but I think they will continue to go full throttle when they realize that they have other changes that's happening in the police department, that they can no longer have the freedom that they had before.
Yeah.
They no longer have this monopoly on authority
Yeah.
that they had before.
Well,
I think you're going to
and
see
change is coming. Look at our
Yes.
city council and our mayor.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a different world now
Yeah.
for
But folks
public
don't want to
safety
live in.
unions. And if you don't see that coming, change is coming,
Yeah.
whether you want it or not. And you can stonewall it and you can try and block it, but
It's
I don't think that you're going to get the support of people who live in the community. I mean, this mayor was elected overwhelmingly, with
Yeah.
overwhelming voter support, and as well as the city council.
Yeah.
So we've got an entirely different look than we had even 10 years ago, let alone 20 or 30.
It's coming, and they can't
It's
change.
here. Well, Dr.
can't
Nolan,
change
we thank you for gracing the airways of the roundtable. We appreciate you taking so much time with us this morning.
Come on anytime.
Dr.
anytime.
Tom Nolan, visiting professor at Emmanuel College, and his book is Perilous Policing, Dr. Tom Nolan, former lieutenant of Boston Police Department, and I'm proud to call him a friend. I appreciate the work that you continue to do. We definitely have to catch up soon, sir, and grab a bite to eat. So I'm going to reach out to you to do that, and we're going to bring Dr. Bradley so he can pay for it.
Exactly. I'm not going to pay. Tom is going to pay for it.
All right.
But Tom, it's very nice. It's very nice hearing you, brother.
Thank you.
Keep it
very
good.
very
Thank you, guys.
Appreciate it. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Wow, that was very enlightening, Dr. Bradley.
They say I am a dreamer, 'cause I still believe that anything is possible as long as you work